welcome to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I'm on staff here at Whitfinstock, and I'm also the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. If you like what you're hearing on our podcast, stop by our website at whitfinstock.com, where you'll find our catalog and where you can also browse our blog. So on this episode, I speak with Professors Leonard Grob and John K. Roth. Leonard Grob is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and John K. Roth is the Edward J. Sexton Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Claremont McKenna College. The two of them have published a number of books together, including a volume on Jewish, Christian, and Muslim relations, as well as another volume that serves as kind of a protest against torture. And then most recently with us at Cascade, a volume which we talk a lot about in this episode called Warnings, the Holocaust, Ukraine, and Endangered American Democracy. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode. So I am here with Drs. Leonard Grob and John Roth, who are the authors of the new Cascade book, Warnings, the Holocaust, Ukraine, and Endangered American Democracy. So it's great to have you both on. As we kick things off, could you, each of you just tell us a bit about yourself and what you do professionally? Let's start with Professor Grob, and then we'll go to Professor Roth.
Thank you, Zechariah, first of all, for having us. So I live in Nyack, New York, just about 30 miles north of the city. My career has been, my doctorate is in philosophy, and I taught for 39 years at Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, New Jersey, where I did a lot of work on religious existential thought, the thought of Martin Buber and Emmanuel Levinas in particular, and also on peace studies. That was early in my career. A roots journey back to Ukraine in 1989 to see the site where my father's family was murdered during the Holocaust. My father was the sole person in his immediate family to come to the United States. He came as a 17-year-old in 1921. The rest of the family were murdered in early 1942 on the streets of Stanislavo, what was then Poland, today Ukraine. My father died at a young age. He had expressed a wish to go back and weep on the soil where his family was murdered. And 25 years after his death, my wife and I went back and we found the house where he had, and my grandparents and aunts and uncles had lived. And I wrote a note with their names on it and tied it around the stems of the flowers, put it on the windowsill. And this was their funeral. Having been shot on the street of Stanislavo and dumped into pits outside the city, they had no burial ceremony. So I had succeeded in naming the dead and was able to carry out my father's wishes. Well, this visit, right after returning, I decided that I had to study the Holocaust. And so for the last 30 plus years, this has been one of the two major areas of study for me and teaching. And I got to know John in this context, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, I imagine. But so this has been one of the two areas. The other area that I have worked in, I'm not a traditional philosopher. I also have chosen to work in Israel-Palestine conflict situation. I belong to two NGOs that are working on resolution of the conflict. My most current work is to come to missions at the United Nations and to present ideas for resolution of the conflict. At this time, especially, this work has become ever so much more important, and it's a harrowing time, but we have to persevere, and this is my way of making the small contribution, but hopefully a contribution. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit of my personal history.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, how about you, Professor Roth?
Well, thank you. And what Lenny has said will both echo and be somewhat different from my identity story. Lenny and I are brothers, partly because we are philosophers, both of us, and certainly because of our long-term commitment to study of the Holocaust and genocide. But my history is different from Lenny's. I have no Holocaust survivors in my family. I come from a Christian background. My forebears were immigrants to the United States from Europe in the 1840s. I was born in 1940. Lenny and I are just about the same age. I happened to be born into the home of a Presbyterian minister. And that left a formidable impact on me, on my upbringing, my thinking, my commitments. As an undergraduate in college at Pomona College in California, I majored in philosophy, and I came to be interested in what philosophers often refer to as the problem of evil. Why is it that there is so much suffering and injustice in the world? How can it be that in situations where life is so precious and good and inspiring, it can be trashed and disrespected and brutalized by human beings? So that question was one that kind of focused the graduate work that I did in ethics and influenced the teaching that I started to do when I returned to Claremont, California, and began 40 plus years of teaching philosophy at Claremont McKenna College, a liberal arts college in Southern California. When I was getting along well early in my career, everything was going nicely for me. I was about to become a father for the second time. My career was going well. I was living my own version of the American dream, a topic that I taught about regularly at the college. And I followed the suggestion of a teacher friend of mine who said to me one day, this is early in the 1970s, that I might be interested in reading some of the writings of Elie Wiesel, who had survived Auschwitz and would later go on to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So I read as much of Wiesel's writings as were available to me in 1972, about the time that my second child was born. And this became a kind of turning point in my life, because on the one hand, I was experiencing good things, hope. I was about to become a father again. My career was going well. It looked to me like I was, living the American dream. But on the other hand, the reading I was doing in Wiesel's writings was taking me into the antithesis of dreams. It was taking me into nightmares, into darkness, into destruction. And this touched me in a way that made me feel I have to find out more about this history. And so I started to do that. And along the way, one of the things I discovered, which I hadn't realized quite as much before, was that my own Christian tradition was deeply implicated in the Holocaust. that German Christians and other Christians had either sided with the Nazis or had stood by and not intervened in ways that would have been the right thing to do. And so my life changed. And like Lenny, I used my philosophical lens as a way of thinking about the Holocaust. And the Holocaust also became a lens for thinking about all sorts of other things, including the American dream and what it needed to become and do in order to be responsible in the aftermath of the Holocaust. So a long career ensued. Along the way, Lenny and I met and became friends, and that's a story unto itself that we can get into because it's important for the book. But I would say the reason that I came to write and participate with Lenny in writing Warnings was because I've had this longstanding interest in American history and culture and literature and politics on the one hand, and my interest in the Holocaust was there on the other side. And as Lenny and I began to look at current events, it seemed to us that writing a book like Warnings turned out to be was a good and important thing to do.
Sure. Well, yeah, thank you both for these introductions. They provide a nice full picture of where each of you are coming from. And as we move forward in our conversation, we'll definitely get into how you two came to know each other and become friends and what kind of prompted this book project that culminated in this book Warnings. But before we get into all of that, we have to cover our icebreaker question that we do with all of our guests, which is if you could place any three people, dead or alive, in a room, and they're kind of all situated around a table, and you can listen into their conversation, all of them together, which three figures would you choose and why?
Well, maybe I can lead off on this, and I'll try to be compact in responding. I thought long and hard about this question, Zachariah, because it's really challenging, and I couldn't restrict it just to three, so I have two sets of three, and I'll go through them quickly. The first is a set of three women I would love to talk to, and here they are, and a quick comment about why. One would be a woman named Charlotte Delbo. Charlotte Delbo was in the French resistance during the Second World War. She was caught by the Nazis and they sent her to Auschwitz. She survived and went on to write an important trilogy called Auschwitz and After. And in this book, one of the things that she keeps emphasizing is the importance of looking at things and trying to see them straightforwardly and clearly. And she focuses often on calling attention to the dead, to people she saw who died in the genocide and who remained part of her memory. And Charlotte Delbo is a beautiful writer. She is somebody who has influenced my thinking a lot because of her emphasis on looking clearly and lucidly at what is happening. Another person who I would include in the three women is a contemporary writer named Anne Applebaum, who is a journalist and an author and a scholar. She often writes informative pieces for The Atlantic. But one of the books that she published while Lenny and I were writing Warnings is called The Twilight of Democracy. And it's a book I highly recommend. Anne Applebaum is a realist. She doesn't pull any punches. And she was writing and continues to write about the dangers facing democracy, not only in the United States, but globally. And then the third person I would have in this first trio is Amanda Gorman. She's a poet, a young poet. She wrote the inaugural poem that she recited at Joe Biden's inauguration in 2020. And I would want to talk to her because she's young and I'm old, and I would want to find out from her what young Americans are most concerned about and what they're thinking about. So those are my three women: Charlotte Delbo, Anne Applebaum, and Amanda Gorman. Then, if three men were present, I would pick, first of all, James Madison, one of the founders of our country, often referred to as the father of the Constitution of the United States. And I would want to talk to him about what he might do differently if he were thinking about the Constitution of the United States in 2023 instead of back in the late 18th century. In particular, I'd want to ask James Madison what he would think today about the Electoral College, which is one of the things that endangers democracy in the United States, in my view. Sometimes we have threats that are coming, from outside and sometimes from inside, but sometimes the inside threats are sitting right in the Constitution of the United States itself. And the Electoral College is something that Lenny and I have called out as needing to be reformed and changed because it isn't a very democratic, lowercase d institution in our politics. A second person I would have at the table would be Elie Wiesel. I've mentioned him before. I'd like Wiesel at the table because of the emphasis in his thinking about the dangers of indifference and neutrality. Wiesel was very strong on this. He's always said that the neutrality always helps the victimizers, not the victims. And he believed that indifference was in some ways worse than evil itself, because indifference to evil allows evil to thrive and injustice to grow. And then my third party in this trio would be Albert Camus, the French novelist and playwright and philosopher, who gives me the model for resistance against injustice and anti-democratic threats. Camus thought that the battle against these kinds of problems was something that had to be viewed as unending, but it required persistence and commitment to keep going, to keep kind of pushing the rock up the hill, even if the rock would often come tumbling back down on us again. So those are my two sets of three. Sorry for a long answer to your shorter question, but I couldn't limit it to just three people.
It is a challenge. No, those sound like two very fascinating conversations for sure. Okay, Professor Grob, how about you? Who would you choose?
Yeah, I love this exercise, and I often ask my students to do something of this kind and have them write a paper where their three choices or so are engaging in conversation and to write that conversation down. So I enjoyed this, although the challenge was enormous to pick three. I went back to Plato's Socrates, whom I would love to talk with. I would Socrates, the Socrates that Plato wrote of was someone for whom the unexamined life is not worth living. I feel this is the cornerstone not only of the philosophical enterprise, but the cornerstone of living a good life. I would want Socrates to challenge me that I not live unthoughtfully, holding on to unexamined assumptions. I think this would be therapeutic for me in the most spiritual sense. Socrates also emphasized the importance of dialogue. That is in dialogue that we can discover, in good dialogue, that we have to think against ourselves, that there is more room to grow. So I would hope to have a conversation where I would be severely challenged by Socrates and to grow spiritually in that sense. The second person that I chose is Martin Buber, the German Jewish thinker who wrote mainly in the first half of the 20th century. Buber also talks about dialogue. He talks about it in a somewhat different way. He contrasts the kind of encounters we have that he labels I-it encounters, in which we instrumentalize the other person or any other being. It needn't be a human person. It can be the way we relate to our environment, for example. Do we utilize it for our own purposes, or do we engage it and learn from it and feel a sense that we can transcend the world in which we see in which we deal with instrumentality only? How can the being whom I encounter serve my needs? And instead move toward a moment of transcendence. So Buber has been a major influence on my life, teaching me about the sacred, about the holy. And he has been vitally important in all my writings, and I hope in the way that I conduct my life in general. And the third person that I chose, and here's where you can say that John and I have spent a fair amount of time together, because I also chose Charlotte Delbo. And I agree, of course, with what John said about her teaching us how to see, not just to look, but to see, and to see the evil that humans can do. Delbo, I've been talking about Buber and transcendence. Delbo wants us to see the ultimate in dehumanization when she spent time in Auschwitz, and in her trilogy, Auschwitz and After, talks about her experience there. But it's not just her teaching to see, that's vitally important, but also for me, I was very much influenced by the biographical fact that in the early years of World War II, Delbo was actually in Argentina working with a theater company there, and but she left the safety of South America to go back to France and to work in the resistance. And she was captured and spent time in Auschwitz. And this is part of her call for us to do something. I would hope that if I had been in that situation, that I might have acted in a similar way. And she calls on us to do this. There's a passage in Auschwitz and After that continues to influence me. And I'll just read it. It's very brief. Delbo says, "You who are passing by, I beg you, do something. Learn a dance step, something to justify your existence, something that gives you the right to be dressed in your skin, in your body hair, learn to walk and to laugh, because it would be too senseless, after all, for so many to have died while you live doing nothing with your life." So that's why I picked Delbo.
That's lovely. Well, it would be a very wide-ranging cast of figures if we imagined all. I guess it would be 8, I think, that we came up with, or that you two came up with, and it gives us, I think, a nice picture into, your own sort of intellectual imaginations and the figures that have left deep impressions on you. So thank you very much for those answers. I want to turn to how you two came to be friends. So how did you come to know each other? How did you meet? And then how did you become good friends? And then also, though, what was the sort of the genesis of this particular book, this warnings book? Let's start with Professor Roth, and then we'll move to Professor Grob.
I met Lenny in 1994 at Dartmouth College. I'd known about him before I met him, but we were attending a conference called Lessons and Legacies, which is a well-known conference that continues even now. It brings together Holocaust and genocide studies people to share their thinking and work. And I was on a panel that included people who were reporting on how their academic disciplines played into or related to their study of the Holocaust. And I was there to represent the discipline of philosophy. So after the session, Lenny came up to me. He'd been in the audience, and he wanted to talk because he was a philosopher as well. And in this field of Holocaust and genocide studies, philosophy is represented, but it isn't the case that there are as many philosophers as there are historians or political theorists or even people who work on literature that comes out of these mass atrocity situations. So Lenny and I, talked, and we could see I could see a friendship was forming. Then about 2 years later, I was on sabbatical in Norway, and I read an announcement about a symposium that was forming. And the announcement was asking if people were interested, if they would sort of apply to become a member of this circle of Holocaust scholars and genocide scholars that was planning to get together for the first time outside of Oxford, England, in 1996. And as I read through the announcement, I saw that one of the organizers of this initiative was Leonard Grob. So I said, I have to apply for that. So I applied, and I was very pleased a few months later when I got a message that said, please, join the group, which I was happy to do. And Lenny and I, in that symposium, which met every other year, and Lenny deserves huge credit for organizing this. This initiative continues also into the 2020s. Lenny's inspiration was that this should not just be a meeting of people who got together and then went away and then came back again 2 years later, but rather the purpose of the meeting was to organize active working groups, writing groups primarily, that would continue work after the meeting in England had ended. And so Lenny and I found ourselves together in a group at Roxton College in England in 1996 that was focused on ethics and the Holocaust. And that circle ended up producing a book we wrote together. And then, Lenny and I worked together over the years in a number of other writing projects. So we were already veterans, I would say, of what we call dialogical writing, the kind that's in Warnings, where one of us starts off by saying something and the other plays the role of Socrates and asks questions, and then the other person responds to the questions. And that's how we developed the chapters in Warnings. But we had done that in some earlier works as well. So we were experienced in working together as writers, as friendly critics, as co-authors who try to spur each other on to achieve greater clarity and depth in our thinking.
I can step in here and I want to add something to this meeting at Dartmouth in 1994. I had read work of John's, and when I saw that he was on the program, I was especially interested in attending this Lessons and Legacies conference. And what I said to John, actually, when I came up after his talk, was what struck me in his talk was that he said, I'm a better philosopher for being a Holocaust scholar. And I had that thought, and I had never heard anyone else utter it. What John was pointing to is the primacy of the ethical enterprise, and that the Holocaust, as one writer, Philip Halley, has put it, is the true north and south of ethics. And it gives us a compass by which to engage in ethical inquiry. So this just hit me as a person who I want to know better. And for these years that, going close to 30 years, John has been not just a scholar colleague, but he has a friend. He has been a good friend. You learn a lot about a co-author when you write a book together, and there were no surprises here. It just reinforced my sense that John, of John's Menschlichkeit, that John is just an outstanding human being who lives what it is he talks about and what he writes. So this meeting at Dartmouth was important to me, and John and I felt very much at home in encouraging dialogue to be part of the books we co-edited and this current book, Warnings, in which whenever I saw John's take on an issue, I was really challenged and inspired at once to write a response. That we try to model the kind of dialogue that we hope will serve as the root of democratic practice anywhere. We wanted to model openness. We wanted to model respect of the other. We wanted to model learning. So that John has come into my life has been very important.
Sure.
Zachariah, I'd like to add just one more note, if I may,
Absolutely.
about the development of the book called Warnings. In 2021 and early 2022, Lenny and I were in conversation. We kept telling each other, let's do something together. It was sort of like, well, let's try writing a book together, but we weren't quite sure what to do. And we were kind of going back and forth trying to pinpoint, what our point of departure should be and what our main topic ought to be. And one day, as we were on a Zoom call with one another, I think it was in January of 2022, Lenny said to me, and this is characteristic of Lenny in a way I'll mention, he said, "John, democracy is in trouble. We ought to write about that." Using the lens of our study of the Holocaust and genocide as a kind of prism for viewing current events. This was typical of Lenny because Lenny's interest in Holocaust studies has always carried with it the challenge that our study of the Holocaust ought to have something to say about current events. So one of the books that Lenny and I helped to edit earlier on was actually about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is, back in view in a major way as we're talking today. We did some other books like that, but it was always Lenny who was the one who was saying, we have to use our expertise about the Holocaust, our ethical concerns that emerge from that study to think about what's going on in the world now. So Lenny suggested, let's write about the dangers that democracy is facing. And when I heard him say that, I said, yes, we've got it. That's our topic. That's our challenge. We ought to write about warnings that the Holocaust provides or helps to focus with regard to the dangers facing American democracy. And that was our point of departure for Warnings.
Yeah, just to add one more small point to what John said, I felt, I wasn't looking for another book to write. I was, well beyond trying to fill my curriculum vitae with items as a professor emeritus. I felt it more as a call, as a response to a call to say something about the situation in which we found ourselves, to make some kind of contribution to it. So without being overly mystical about it, I will say that it wasn't in any way arbitrary. it was a sense that this is something that we needed to do.
Sure. Well, this, I think, gives us a nice sense of kind of where you both are coming from, and a good sense of your friendship and the work you've done together, and sort of what prompted this particular book. So let's turn now to discussing the book, this book, Warnings. I really like in the prologue, you have this kind of punchy, provocative, short little line, which I'll quote here, which just says, "Democracy's existence invites its demise." So could you elaborate on what you mean by that exactly? And either one of you can kick off on this one.
Yeah, I'll start off. We make the point throughout the book that democracy is actually, we say this explicitly, it's more verb than noun. It's a living process more than any static product. That democracy has to continually democratize itself. I mean, it's up to us to work at all times to keep liberal democracy alive. This is especially true because democracy can be used against itself. We really talk about liberal democracy because under the heading of democracy, we have examples of illiberal democracies at the current moment in Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. It's liberal democracy that we're talking about as something that we need to work tirelessly to keep alive, because otherwise democracy can be turned against itself. One example from the Holocaust that John often cites, and I'll just take advantage of going first here, is how Hitler came to possess total power in Germany. He did not come to power via some violent coup. He assumed absolute dictatorial power legally a few months after he became chancellor in 1933. The Reichstag passed what was called the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler the power to govern by decree without the parliament's consent. That allowed him to set aside all provisions in the Weimar democracy. And this, of course, led eventually to World War II and a death sentence for Europe's Jews. So we have to be very careful. John gave an example in our time of minority rule, which undermines democracy, even though it could be used in the name of democracy. John mentioned the electoral college system, and there are many other examples. So it's work that is ongoing, work that is constant. It is indeed more verb than noun.
When Lenny and I were proposing this book to Wiesel, Cascade Books, one of the questions that we were asked was a challenging one. The question was worded something like this. It said, tell us in 7 words, kind of emphasizing, we're not kidding, just 7 words, what your book is about. And the answer that Lenny and I came up with to that challenging question was the following. We said, and there are just 7 words here in this response: Warnings defends liberal democracy against 2020's threats. So what are some of the threats that we see? Well, authoritarianism, lies. As Lenny and I looked at the ills facing and endangering American democracy, nearly always we found that a common denominator had to do with lies. Lies big and small. Other threats, divisions, polarizations, sometimes based on white supremacy. What Lenny has called minority rule is another threat to democracy. The philosophy that might makes right, and that my perceived rights and privileges trump yours. And all of these involve cases where the institutions of democracy can be used against itself, and where democracy can invite its own demise. Courts can be abused and used in ways that subvert democracy. Law itself can do so. Even voting, as Lenny pointed out in the German situation back in 1933, even voting can pass legislation that is not friendly to democracy. As we understand democracy, we're wanting to defend what we call liberal democracy, and that includes basic fundamental things like respect for the rule of law, honoring fair and free elections, defending human rights, expanding them, not taking them away. And it's pluralistic. That is, it celebrates and honors differences and diversity. And that goes to, cultural variety and religious variety and even political differences that we may share. But it's also inclusive. Liberal democracy is. That is, it finds room and makes space for differences, emphasizing the importance of respect for others, and including in that respect the respect for open inquiry, reliable education, and respect for truth.
Sure. Okay. One of the things I would really like to talk about is the role, which you guys speak about in the book, is the role, or the sort of, I guess, the relationship between kind of personal character or virtue and democracy. So you write in Warnings, for instance, about kind of how there are limitations to kind of thinking about democracy or trying to kind of codify democracy strictly through legislation, as you were just kind of saying, Professor Roth. And you make a call that there's actually a necessity for citizens to have a certain character or a certain virtue in order for democracy even to sort of survive, not to mention, the prospect of it actually flourishing. So why do you think that this topic of character seems kind of so absent or so neglected from kind of the contemporary political discourse in America? Because I think that it seems that the only time in general that I hear folks talk about character is when they're sort of using it as a weapon to kind of bludgeon some political character that they don't like or that they disagree with, that they think lacks some, necessary character. But I'm curious, what you all think of sort of the place or the non-place of character in the current discussion.
In my conversation group, I mentioned a few minutes ago that one of the people I would like to talk to is James Madison, one of the so-called founding fathers, as they're referred to. And he's not the only one, but all of these kind of late 18th century figures who were helping to establish the Constitution of the United States, they believed at least three things that might seem to be in conflict, but actually are not. They all had a rather dim view of what human beings are typically likely to do. They tended to think that human beings are likely to be self-centered, selfish, not very civic-minded, that they have kind of, all of us as human beings, to use an old word, are sinners in one way or another. So they thought that if you're going to have a decent government that isn't tyrannical and isn't serving only special interests, you have to create a system that has that familiar phrase, checks and balances attached to it. So they established a form of government that had the three branches, the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. And they tried to balance these things in such a way that none of them could run amok and lead to tyranny. But, and this is the third thing, they also called consistently for the importance of, and here's an old-fashioned word again, the importance of virtue. That even though people were sinners, and even though we would set up, a system of checks and balances politically to guard against the excesses and extremes that might result, none of this would work out well unless people kept reminding themselves of the importance of virtue. Now, what did they mean by virtue? Well, they meant things that we would associate with good character. That is, that you're honest, that you tell the truth, that you don't cheat, that you don't betray others, that you don't use people in ways that brutalize them and disrespect them. Now, they realized that this too was also probably not going to succeed terribly well, but they never gave up on the importance of emphasizing the importance of these qualities if the democracy, the representative democracy that they had been striving for, would have a chance to succeed. So this is why Lenny and I, in part, we subscribe to this part of the history of American democracy, that character matters. We say ethics matters. That's the way we put it in a nutshell, that respecting what is just, honoring what is fair, keeping an eye, as Charlotte Delbo, keep an eye focused on what is good and right and honest. Absent these things, democracy doesn't really have much of a chance. And that's why democracy is always fragile. And as Lenny keeps emphasizing again and again, that's why democracy has to be looked at as more of a verb, a process, a set of activities than a noun, a set of institutions that somehow we assume can save us no matter how corrupt or irresponsible we become.
Yeah, I think John has said it well. We claim throughout the book that the institutions and procedures of democracy are only as good as the people who create and sustain them. So, Zachariah, your question was, why is there so little talk today of character? I sense that it's just so much easier to talk about the nitty-gritties of democracy, to talk about those procedures. It's easy to talk about what happened in the House of Representatives yesterday or many times in the last several weeks, for example, than it is to ask what kind of human being do we strive to be? That there is no human nature as such. We make the human nature. We give that human nature that we choose. We give it to ourselves. We create ourselves in this sense, ethically speaking. So this is harder, I think, for people to talk about. It's easy for philosophers, and we hope to model this for others. It's not that we are better, but than others for talking about it. Yet we think it's so important to deal precisely with who are the human beings, what is their character behind the institutions that we say we treasure so much. So I think that that's a response, Zachariah, to your question. And in terms of our former president, Trump, I think that some of the talk about character has not been fruitful, but others have, because the question is our leadership such that we are encouraged to take the best of ourselves, present the best of ourselves to the world? Or is it that we have been given permission to let the worst of ourselves, the worst of the human nature we've given to ourselves? So while I think some of the talk about Donald Trump has not been fruitful, I think in other ways it has been, insofar as it focuses on the nature of what good character is.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, you guys have mentioned a bit already about some of the the threats that we see to democracy happening today. And one that you mention in the book is this tendency, especially kind of in America, for us as citizens to see our nation as comprised not of a we or an us, but of what you guys call kind of a we and they, or an us and them. So there's this kind of oppositional, antagonistic character to how we even conceive of us, ourselves as an American nation. So do you think that it's possible to democracy to be sustained in the long term when we find ourselves in kind of such a vigorously divided society? Either one of you can kick off this one as well.
Yeah. I'll take first shot at it. The polarization is seemingly at a peak here. Not that there haven't been other times in the history of our nation that there has been polarization, but right now it is kind of front and center. And it poses a tremendous challenge to us because it's easy to despair that we will never come together. It seems like the distance between one another. Can we even be civil toward one another? That's before us. So where do we see some hope of pulling ourselves together, which is necessary for democracy? Not that we all are homogeneous, but that we're able to talk with one another and learn from one another, learn from our differences, engage dialogically. So I think that one response to the challenge is for those of us who value community to gather. We've had a series of interviews in podcasts about this book, and we're certainly valuing this one that Zachariah has posed to us. This is an example, though, of pulling together, engaging in dialogue that we hope to be fruitful, that we can learn something from one another. John and I have each made appearances. We've talked before our local libraries. And I felt in that sense that even though there may have been people with disparate views, that everyone was together on the importance of learning from one another and being respectful toward one another. I also think another hope is not to be dismissive of the other just because that person is voting for another political party, but rather to try to engage in the beginnings of dialogue. I'm not here being facile in my thought that, for example, that I could engage a follower of Donald Trump in immediately to cause that person to rethink his or her political affinity. But I don't want to other that person. We know how bad othering is, how to totalize or categorize the other. I want to be able to approach someone who is a follower of Donald Trump and to make the beginnings of inroad, to find some commonality, whether it's talking about our grandchildren, talking about things we like to do together, just not to write off the other in the name of totalizing that person. And finally, another source of hope is parenting and education. I'm hoping that I won't be around to see much of it, but I'm hoping that in parenting and educating for democracy, that we can begin to attack the polarization that we see and bring the Socratic view, bring a view like that of Martin Buber to bear in the way we parent and the way we educate.
Mm-hmm. Professor Roth, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to mention something very local. I live in a small town in Washington State where I'm in active retirement, as we say. Lenny would say the same of him. We had a hotly contested school board election in my local school district this year, and it was emblematic of school board elections around the country this November, where different philosophies about how children should be educated in its extreme forms. It's involved attempts to ban books and to restrict what goes on in school libraries, and even to censor what teachers can do. We didn't have any of that here in Winthrop, Washington, but we did have a contested school board election. And there were 3 seats that were up for election, and the election results came in, and the election was not particularly close. That is, the 3 winners who were mostly incumbents, prevailed by a comfortable margin. But I was pleased to see in our local weekly paper last week after the election that one of the candidates who had lost wrote a very generous letter to the editor, saying that, he wanted to applaud the election, and that while he didn't prevail in his attempt to hold a seat on the school board, he remained committed to doing what he can to ensure that our school district functions well and that the children are well educated within it. And I thought, well, there's a good example, a good local example of how democracy is at work. No one who lost the election was saying the election was rigged or that it was stolen from them. People who won did so graciously, and those who did not win, at least in this one instance, stated publicly that they had appreciated the process and that they were going to continue working to support the school district, not giving up their beliefs or their ideas, but not giving up on the process either. So there are these examples, and they can be built upon. It isn't rocket science. This is what we have been used to doing in the United States when we've been at our best, and we can reclaim that tradition. Lenny and I have come to the conclusion, partly as we wrote the book and then in these conversations we've been having about it since, that you can't rescue endangered American democracy. You can't sustain and protect democracy by becoming anti-democratic. You have to take the risk that goes with committing ourselves to the practice of democracy, which, as the local example I cited indicates, is honoring and respecting fair and free elections.
Yeah, it's nice to hear examples like that, and one hopes that we can start to see a revitalization of that kind of way of carrying ourselves, even at the higher levels. Well, especially I think at the higher levels of government. So appreciate that example, and I really like also Professor Grob, some of your discussion of kind of Buber and Levinas, and not, the importance of not othering people we disagree with, not, like you said, not totalizing or categorizing them, or not rushing to do so anyways, but recognizing them as, human beings just like me, who suffer and struggle and who will die just like I will. Sort of, seeing them first as a human being. I think that's such an important part. And so, since we're talking about Buber and Levinas, and especially for Levinas, for whom the Holocaust is so important and so prominent in the background of his thought, let's turn to kind of the role that the Holocaust plays in this warnings book. You both mentioned that you're scholars of the Holocaust, and you come back time and again kind of throughout the book to mentions and discussions of the Holocaust. So what connections do you make between the Holocaust and the kinds of dangers we're talking about to democracy that we're sort of confronting in our world today? And then also, how might the Holocaust sort of inform us? How might we learn from it as we face some of these dangers to democracy?
The first thing to say, Zachariah, is that we begin from the perspective that the Holocaust is not something that just appeared out of nowhere. It had lots of antecedents, and these were things that were taking place primarily in the 1930s and into the early 1940s. And high on the list, there were two things that were high on the list that made us, think that there are some connections between the 1930s and the 2020s. One was that Hitler despised democracy and worked as quickly as he could to dismantle it once he came to power in January of 1933. Now, the democracy that he dismantled was not a strong democracy. It was weak and fragile. It was the post-World War I democracy that was set up in what was called the Weimar Republic. But nonetheless, Hitler got rid of it as quickly as he could, and this reflected his own philosophical belief that democracy was something to be regarded from his point of view as a danger. He even kind of equated it with Jewish interests, and therefore that made democracy even more something that he opposed. The second thing that struck us in a really strong way was how much Hitler's success, and we have to think of it that way. I mean, Hitler did control a country and he had his way for way too long, but his project was controlled by the use of big lies. Nearly everything that Nazism represented or stood for was rooted in some big lie or other. The racial anti-Semitism that Hitler espoused was based on a big lie. The notion that Germany had been betrayed at the end of World War I by a so-called stab in the back was a big lie. And all the propagandizing about Aryan superiority and even the imagery that Hitler used about the Jews, calling them vermin, a term that has come back into prominence just this week. All of this was based on a series of falsehoods that were repeated again and again and publicized and propagandized until they became sort of the mantras of a regime. So those were two things: Hitler's despising of democracy, Hitler's use of the big lie that seemed to us to have echoes in the 2020s, not only in the United States, but particularly in our own country. And we had a contemporary example of this going on concurrently, which is Vladimir Putin and his anti-democratic sentiments manifesting themselves in his invasion of Ukraine and the big lies that Putin tells about almost everything that comes across his purview. So these were the things that caught us. We weren't arguing in the book that what awaits the United States if the warnings are unheeded is the Holocaust, a massive genocide that the American history would incorporate. It wasn't that. What we saw was that there were forces at work in our own country that could lead to the demise of democracy. And Lenny and I, as we wrote the book, came to believe more and more that democracy is not perfect as we practice it here today, but it is something that is good, something worth defending, something worth expanding, something worth sustaining going forward and opening, expanding it if we can.
I'll just add a few other things that, as Holocaust scholars, we, as John has used the word, we looked at what's happening today with our democracy under threat through the lens that we're accustomed to, the lens of Holocaust scholarship. We saw, for example, how religion was co-opted during the period of the 1930s in Germany. The German Christians, both Protestants and Catholics, were given over to Hitler's regime, to Nazism. And today we see some signs in Christian nationalism, especially in the evangelicals today, who are not going to the roots of their religious traditions, but have in some ways departed from those roots in ways that would threaten our democracy. We look at education during the 1930s in Germany. We see how education was idolatrous. It was for the sake of the Aryan nation and Hitler in particular. And we certainly see today the threats to our own educational system through control of content, especially content that has to do with issues of gender or our history of endemic racism. We see even some on the extremes have talked about burning books, but certainly the removal of them is a threat that recalls in some ways what was happening to education and books in particular in 1930s. And finally, I think bystander behavior during the 1930s was evident, and we see some of this today. In Germany, ordinary Germans failed to act when they could have without threats to their personhood. They, for example, when Jewish professionals, doctors, lawyers, bankers, were dismissed peremptorily from their positions, and the physicians in Germany said, "We will not practice medicine unless our Jewish colleagues are reinstated." And the lawyers said, "There will be no work in our courts unless our Jewish colleagues are reinstated." Had that happened, there would not have necessarily been a Holocaust. Today, we see bystander behavior, especially among the traditional conservatives in the Republican Party. They have been quiet. It isn't only the loud supporters of Donald Trump and his threats to democracy that we have to worry about. We have to worry equally about the silence of so much of the rest of the Republican Party. So these were also elements that echoed in our minds as we wanted to examine the threats to our democracy currently.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean on the topic of some of these kind of parallels we're drawing between sort of, the Holocaust era and what we're facing today, and looking more kind of specifically at sort of the MAGA movement, because obviously there's a ton of conversation about MAGA and MAGA supporters having that there's sort of this eerie resemblance to what we saw in the National Socialist Party in Germany. So do you think that those claims that there's sort of a family resemblance, do you think those are justified? Do you think that they're overblown or underplayed? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
We have to be careful. I think John and I were aware from the beginning not to make any facile claims that although our democracy is in trouble, this is not the 1930s in Germany. We have to both draw lessons from the parallels that exist while not overstating our case. But we're frightened when we hear about retribution, when we hear that those who have accused Donald Trump of wrongdoing in the several indictments levied against him, when we hear Mr. Trump say that if he is elected president in 2024, that he will levy retribution against those who dared challenge him and accuse him of wrongdoing. This is a warning not to be taken lightly. The MAGA movement has taken over one of our two major political parties, and this is frightening to us.
I think one of the things, Zachariah, that we emphasize toward the end of the book is that Americans are prone to take democracy for granted, that there may be a danger. Others are saying this today, that we are sleepwalking toward the demise of democracy. And then the thing that Lenny and I stressed toward the end, that Americans can scarcely imagine what it would be like long term for us to lose our democracy. We take it for granted. We think our institutions will save us, but none of that is guaranteed. And we could, and the 2024 national election is crucial. We wrote the book with our eyes on that presidential national election in 2024 as certainly being the most important presidential election in the lifetime that Lenny and I have shared, which is more than 80 years. And we are worried. And I think another thing that Lenny and I would agree on is that when we started writing the book in 2022, since that time, things have not gotten better. The danger is greater than it was than when we started. And symptomatic of that has to do with rhetoric that is being used by one of the leading candidates for the presidency, Donald Trump, that includes, even though he backtracked on some of it, the idea of suspending the Constitution, taking retribution, weaponizing the Department of Justice, and having in place plans called Project 2025 that are laying the groundwork for the personnel structuring of the second Trump administration if he prevails in the election. And it's definitely not a picture that underscores and validates and strengthens democracy in the United States. It does just the opposite. So the coming election in 2024, in our view, the view that Lenny and I share, is absolutely pivotal for the future of democracy in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's becoming more and more apparent for sure that perhaps democracy is not quite as rock solid or as impenetrable as we once thought it was, and even indeed that it's much more fragile than we might have imagined. As we close out our conversation, I want to turn to the final pages of this book, Warnings. You call up a really wonderful image from the philosopher Philip Halley, whom we've mentioned already. He uses this metaphor of a hurricane, right? He uses it as kind of a political metaphor. So could you share a bit about what Halley was kind of doing with this image, and then also how you are making use of it in the book?
Maybe I can start on this, and Lenny can add a little bit. Philip Halley was a slightly older contemporary to Lenny and me. He's not alive today, but Lenny and I think both knew him. He was a philosopher, and he also spent his career teaching in a liberal arts institution like Lenny and I have done. Halley taught for many years at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And it was there one year that a hurricane kind of stirred itself up out of the Atlantic and found its way up into parts of New England. And Halley witnessed this, and he observed the hurricane, and he was attracted to the eye of the hurricane, where as he observed it and then wrote about it, he saw that the sky was blue. And he could see that there were birds flying around in the eye of the hurricane. And at first he was taken by, how this seemed to be a kind of image of how there could be in the midst of the hurricane space for activity that wasn't destructive, that, included the birds flying around. Then later he found out from a scientist who knew better than Halley what was going on in the eye of the hurricane, that far from flying around in the eye of the hurricane in a way that was sort of beautiful and peaceful, the birds were literally battling for their lives because they kept running into the edges of the hurricane that were utterly destructive to them. So Halley had to rethink his hurricane metaphor a bit, which he went on to do. And where he came out was that, the birds were in trouble, but still in the midst of the hurricane, there was space, there was the blue, and he didn't come away from his revised thinking about the eye of the hurricane in despair or in a feeling of hopelessness, but rather that if you could expand the blue, the place for safety within the hurricane might be increased. And so this became his metaphor for the ethical life. And we found it a good way to end the book with the idea that what we have to do is take seriously Halley's warning. His warning was, it's the hurricane we're in, don't forget it. But at the same time, the ethical imperative in the midst of the hurricane is to expand the blue, to create space, as he put it, for love and respect and for hope as best we can do it. And this seemed to Lenny and me to be a good kind of story. Halley was a wonderful storyteller, a good kind of story on which to end our book with the idea that, as Lenny likes to say, democracy is a verb, not a noun. It's a process, it's a challenge, it's an ongoing project. And it succeeds or fails to the extent that we can expand the blue in the midst of the hurricane.
John spoke beautifully, and it was John actually who brought this image to our book. I would just add, first of all, the image doesn't play down the destructive power. The power is there, but the blue is there also. But our job is to expand, and that each of us can find ways to expand the blue from where we stand. If we're teachers, we have a special opportunity. If we are other professionals, doctors can certainly work to serve the underserved. Attorneys can certainly work with the refugee population, but everyone can do something, whether they're professional or not, by being kind to each other. One thing that we have been missing, I think, especially since Donald Trump's presidency, it's not gone away, even with Biden's ascendancy to the presidency, is that there's just a lot of hate around and a lot of lack of kindness. So everyone can contribute to expanding the blue by being kind. And I'm really struck by a quote from Dostoevsky. Actually, the quote was cited by philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who I work on. Dostoevsky says, each of us is responsible for one another, and I more than the others. That seems to me to be a call to expand the blue.
Sure. No, that's beautiful. Very nicely said. Okay, well, this seems like a great place for us to wrap up today. For our listeners, you can find a link in the show notes to Professor Grob and Professor Roth's new book, Warnings, the Holocaust, Ukraine, and Endangered American Democracy. Professors Grob and Roth, I just want to say thank you very much for taking some time to talk. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
And thank you for inviting us.
Thank you so much. We appreciated very much the probing questions that you asked us, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to talk about the book.